Hello everyone! This week we will study chapter 11 about speech functions, politeness and cross-cultural communications. We are from group 3. My name is Rummanatul Alaniyah and my partner Fidaiyatul Milah are going to explain to you about this material. So, happy watching! In this chapter, there are three subtopics to be discussed. First, the functions of speech, focusing on directives. The second, politeness and address forms. And the last, linguistic politeness in different cultures, focusing on greetings. Now let's start with the first subtopic, the function of speech. There are a number of ways of categorizing the function of speech. On the book, you can find 6 speech functions categorizations. They are expressive, directive, referential, metalinguistic, poetic, and emphatic. On the slide, you can see the 6 speech function categorizations. Expressive utterances express the speaker's feeling. For example, I'm feeling great today. Directive utterances is used to get someone to do something. For example, clear the table, please. And referential utterances provide information, such as, at the third stroke it will be 3 o'clock precisely. In metalinguistic utterances, it comments on the language itself. For example, hegemony is not a common word. And on the fifth, poetic utterances focus on aesthetic features of language. For example, the language in a poem or poetry, or in an ear-catching motto, a rhyme, or twist tongue like Peter Piker pick a pick of pickled peppers. And the last is emphatic utterance. It expresses solidarity and empathy with others. For example, hi, how are you? Lovely day, isn't it? Well, an utterance, in fact, may express more than one function, and any function may be expressed by a stretch of discourse which doesn't exactly coincide in an utterance. So, for example, in a love poem, it used both poetic and expressive utterances. And you can see the first 3 functions are very fundamental functions of language. Why? Perhaps because they derive from the basic components of any interactions. For example, expressive utterances is on the speaker, directives is on the addressee, and referential is on the message itself. And poetic communication convey an effective or social message rather than a referential one, as language is not used to convey only referential information but also expresses information about social relationships. Well, beside the 6 speech categories, you can find also in the book other speech function categories, such as proposed by Michael Halliday. For instance, he identified a function of language concerned with learning, which he labeled as heuristic and closed as the tell me why functions, and other speech categories such as commissive, which deal with the promises and threats, and the last is performative or declarations, which deal with marriage vows, pacts, and declarations of war. Now we are focusing on the speech function directive. Directive, as I've mentioned before, is used to get people to do something. So the speech act which express directive force vary in strength. We can attempt to get people to sit down, for example, by suggesting or inviting them to do so, or by ordering or commanding them to sit down. So orders and commands are the speech act which are generally expressed in imperative form, while the polite attempt to get people to do something tend to use interrogative or declarative. Here are the example of directive you can see on the slide. The first example on the top is the strongest one, which is in imperative, and the less strong is on the bottom, which is in declarative. Well, in general, interrogative and declarative are more polite than the imperative, but it has a great deal which depend on intonation, tone of voice, and context. In the example 4, you can see, in a shop, the utterance A will be considered normal, but the utterance B might be well regarded as sarcastic one. Well, how do people decide which form to use in a particular context? What are the social factors which affect a speaker's choice of the appropriate form of directive? Well, there are some social factors which affect speaker choice of directive. First is the social distance between the participant. The second is their relative status, and the last is the formality of the context. The first example is that imperative is used more by people who are close friends or intimate. You can see on example 5, such as in sentence E, wash your hands for dinner, children. It might be used by parents to their children. Well, the next is that superiors tend to use imperative to subordinates. So in example 6, you can see that teachers often use imperative to pupils, such as in utterance A. Open your book at page 32. Well, teacher and student are so clear-cut that teacher can also use minimally explicit form and be confident that they will be interpreted accurately as directive. It means that students consider everything the teacher says as a possible directive, as in example 7, such as utterance A, blackboard, which means clean the blackboard. The next is about the formality of the context and stages. Formality and stages may be very relevant in choosing an appropriate directive forms. You can see in example 9, the required action, the read citations on the example, is embedded as a subordinate clause in the second part of the declarative sentence, and this is a common grammatical means of expressing directive less directly and more politely. While the relevance of stages in a less formal context was nicely demonstrated in a study of children's directives in a New Zealand child care center. You can see on the book, relative stages in the center was determined by age and size. So the oldest, the biggest, the strongest child in the center used the most imperative, while the attempt by the other children to get him, the strongest and biggest child on the center, to operate involve less direct forms such as I think I need that now, or could I borrow that? Well, as I've mentioned before, that imperative are used by people who are know each other well or to subordinates, while the interrogative and declarative, including hints, tend to be used between those who are less familiar with each other or where there is some reason to feel that the task being requested is not routine. But hints may also be used for humorous effect between people who are close friends. The example you can see on the slide in example 12 in sentence A and B. The next is that girls and women tend to use more polite and less direct forms of directive than males. So the example you can see on example 13 in the slide, the utterance TEF are uttered by female. Other example you can find on our book is in a study of doctors' directive to patients, shows that male doctors typically use imperative such as eat more fruit, while female doctors use less direct forms such as maybe you could try fresh fruit for dessert. The last is an exception of what I've mentioned before. So not all communities follows the pattern that I have mentioned before. In a study of a community of lower-class male migrant agricultural workers on the eastern seaboard of the USA, for example, it was found that almost all the directives took the form of imperative, regardless of the difference in social status, social distance, the presence of outsiders, and the setting or locations. It can be seen in example 14 on the slide. So researchers in this study consider that the insecure and unpleasant work conditions of the participants in this community of practice accounted for the antagonism evident in many of their social interactions. So the relationship between the workers and their bosses are characterized by mistrust and tension on both sides. So their language enacted this unhappy social relationship in that the great majority of directives, whether from bosses to workers or vice versa, took the form of unmodified imperative. Well, that's the end of the first half of the explanation. The next will be explained by Fidaiyatul Milah.
Well, everyone, my name is Fidaiyatul Milah. My last number is 029. Now I'm going to continue our discussion about politeness and address forms and politeness in different cultures. Politeness and address forms. If you see the example 16, you will see the difficulty to learn a politeness because it involves understanding not the language but also the social and cultural values of the community. And in example 17, it depicts that the workplace doesn't increase the politeness because the term of politeness here is how discourse strategies or linguistic devices have been used to maintain a harmonious relations and avoid causing trouble. So we need to understand the three dimensions of politeness that influence people to express the same speech function differently on different occasions. They are social distance or solidarity, relative power or social status, and formality. Informality dimension depends on your roles in the context. For example, informal contexts such as in law courts where people act in role, they will be called your honor. But in informal contexts such as in dinner table, they will be called their first name. And the dimension also provide two different types of politeness. The first one is positive politeness is solidarity oriented. For example, the boss suggests her employee use first name to her, which is expressing solidarity and minimizing status differences. And the second is negative politeness, respect in status differences. For example, using title and last name to your superiors or to older people that you don't know well. As I explained before, it shows that the interaction is not static because there are the dimensions that determine ways of speaking politely. The last subtopic is linguistic politeness in different cultures. People from culturally different speech communities often express particular speech acts differently. As a result, misunderstandings may arise and they may unwittingly offend one another. Like in this example, we know that Christina encountered a cross-cultural communication problem. This problem makes a misunderstanding between Christina and her sister-in-law. In Green Highlight, it shows American culture, in which Christina introduced her sister-in-law to anyone she had not previously met. In contrast, it will make someone feel offended in Sweden culture because it implies she didn't know the rules for greeting people politely. Then differ cross-culturally in polite acceptance and refusal. Being polite in such context involves knowing how to express a range of speech functions in culturally appropriate way. Like in the example 24, the phrase of bring a plate in New Zealand and the others will have different meaning. So those examples indicate the different social values and attitudes of different societies. The next is greetings. In the first example is a normal greeting routine that we usually find it in any occasion, but it will be different in formal greeting ritual in specific culture. Like in the second example, which shows the complex procedure of the Maori formal greeting ritual. So, in any particular culture, welcoming someone properly Even in informal context is very important, and sharing food is also an important sign that the occasion has been concluded appropriately. Well, that's all about speech functions, politeness, and cross-cultural communication. And we are sorry if there are any mistakes and lack of material of what we have presented. And don't forget to write down your questions in the discussion forum. And thank you very much.